The ABLE study into discrimination said that the average person thinks not only is it okay to stigmatise and discriminate, it's actually good for the drug user to do that.
Discrimination is enacted stigma. It's the outcome of stigmatisation, and stigmatisation is a social process which produces, legitimises and perpetuates social inequality.
All human cultures use psychoactive drugs. This is almost a cultural universal.
The way that we deal with illicit drugs in Australian society at the moment is that we criminalise people.
There was this real belief that drug users are intrinsically dishonest and are breaking the law, so are therefore are bad people, because only bad people break the law, not seeing that it's a bad law.
That means that people are demonised in society, are seen, as, literally as scum, and people, when you're treated like that every day of your life, it really affects you, and you start to see yourself in those terms.
It actually degrades a person's self-confidence and sense of worth to the point where they don't think they deserve all the things that everybody else takes as their right. Healthcare, dental care, access to housing, access to just a sense of community and a sense of belonging.
It is not good to discriminate by stereotyping people as junkies. People are individual and their behaviour can be responsible. It varies from person to person, and to make those generalisations and really negative ones and to exclude people from society is actually really dangerous.
Stigma discrimination actually kills people.
A friend of mine last year committed suicide because her kids were taken off her, and she was trying to see her kids who were placed with her mother, and because Care and Protection had told the mother that she was using drugs, she refused her daughter to be able to see the kids, and then, so she jumped off a building, And that stuff happens all the time.
People overdose, their friends won't call the ambulance because they're frightened that they will go to jail or be charged. People get HIV and hepatitis C because they won't access needle exchange programs.
There's all the illegality factor, I think, is so huge in this, and was a big issue in the early days of the gay movement as well, when homosexuality was still illegal. What we saw was the change in the laws that removed the illegality of homosexuality was a real turning point for that movement.
It's part of human history and human culture to use psychoactive drugs. Whereas I think, the sort of assumption that we often have is that using psychoactive drugs is actually sort of against human nature or against civilization.
People felt that it was the right thing to do. If you discriminated against injecting drug users, they somehow thought they could stop the behaviour happening. Most of them had never met an injecting drug user in their lives. They couldn't say that they knew any, but they could very clearly tell us what they thought an injecting drug user was: a homeless person who was untidy with no teeth and behaved very badly.
I think it dumbs down society in some ways, because I think it perpetuates a belief that there are good and bad drug users, and it sort of highlights a hypocrisy in our society by demonising certain classes of drug user, while we are assailed with alcohol advertising, particularly at this time of the year, endlessly. It's quite an interesting phenomenon.
They worry about this sort of mishmash of myths and urban legends that have got, they've seen films, they've read stories, and they're not quite sure what they're afraid of, but they know drug users are somebody that they're meant to be afraid of. So you could almost hear them trying to find things to rationalise the fear when they really weren't quite sure about it anyway.
It also inculcates a sense that they are not whole citizens and not part of a community, and they're not very important. And I think this is very dangerous for anyone's health if they develop that sensibility.
They're fearful that injecting drug users are volatile and can just go off at any moment for anything. They worry that injecting drug use is a behaviour that will be caught by other people. So if you hang around injecting drug users, you will inevitably become an injecting drug user.
It really marginalises people. It pushes them away from services, from support, from their own families and friends.
If people feel that they're being discriminated against, particularly by the healthcare sector or by law enforcement agencies or by other groups, then they're less likely to engage with the healthcare sector, and so therefore people will be missing out on important prevention messages. People will be missing out on the opportunity to be tested to see if they've been exposed to serious bloodborne viruses. People will miss out on the opportunity to have access to treatment, which can be life-saving, and treatment which can result in someone no longer being at risk of transmitting serious conditions to other people. So if we have a situation where people do feel discriminated against, or they feel if they go into healthcare settings they're going to be discriminated against, then many people will stay away from those settings.
There's all these infections occurring that are entirely preventable, but they're not being prevented at the moment because people are fearful of how they'll be treated.
Healthcare workers are part of the community. Now, you might say, is there an element within the community that have these discriminatory attitudes towards people who inject because they've had a bad experience? I don't think that's the case. I actually think it's because there's a significant conservative element. Some of it is inflamed by media and other influences that make people, for whatever reason, fearful of someone that's different. It's not because that they've had a bad experience or that someone in the street has tried to assault them or whatever. That just doesn't happen very often at all.
It is such a social phenomenon, stigmatisation, and it's so dependent upon social dynamics that yes, it affects everybody and anybody who has anything to do with providing services to people who inject drugs.
We need to keep working at it. It's an ongoing battle, but I think what we need to do is to just talk about fundamental rights. I think it's such a basic right that someone who is coming for healthcare should receive that healthcare without any judgment.
There's certainly evidence that if people feel like they are part of a society, then they're much more likely to access the services that society provides, and the implications of that for individual people's health and also for the control of bloodborne viral epidemics like hepatitis is significant.
We shouldn't be discriminating against anybody on the basis of particular behaviours, just as we wouldn't find it appropriate to discriminate against somebody on the basis of their age or their gender or their sexual orientation or whether they had a disability or their ethnicity or any other reason. So as a society we need to tackle that. I think that Australia's done well at doing this in the past, and particularly in response to the HIV epidemic. And I hope that we continue to be a country where people speak out actively where they see discrimination and stigma occurring, because it's not only harmful to the wider community through the public health aspects, but it's incredibly harmful to the individual as well.
Drug use in society is tolerated a little more if the person has a profile, if the person has charisma and power, and is part of a kind of a dominant social category. And a lot of our actors and musicians and sports people can probably fit into that. Whereas when it's somebody who's a part of a stigmatised group and aren't well known, are not known for making loads of money, etc., I think that's a very different issue.
We're all human beings. I think that every person who injects drugs is a son or a daughter or a mother or a father or a brother or a sister or a friend or a colleague of many, many other people. So whether we realise it or not, many of us know a number of people who inject drugs, and yet we discriminate against a group of people when include in that group of people are people that we actually care about and love as well.
In reality, a really small minority of people in the Australian community will ever inject an illicit drug. It is a small or a minority practice, but that doesn't mean that it is okay for us to treat people who do it in a stigmatising and discriminatory manner, in a way that causes a great deal of disease and illness and death.
In the last 5 years, there have been some positive indications. There are at least now bodies around the world who are actually standing up for the first time with some eminent people. Sir Richard Branson is one person that comes to mind, who I couldn't imagine 10 or 15 years ago anybody saying what these people are saying. And they're actually pushing very logical, rational arguments as to why prohibition has failed and always will, and why decriminalisation and legalisation of drugs is necessary.
Well, I think it's a harm reduction and public health issue that people who inject drugs should be supported by the community in terms of looking after their own health.
Do we really think as a community that it is reasonable that we set things up so that if people do end up injecting drugs, the penalty for that is life-threatening illnesses that are entirely preventable and possibly death? Is that what we want, given that these people are our family and friends?